Judge, I'm wondering if we may have the overhead turned on. Sir, when we left off, we were talking about the second, or prong number 2 under the C, factors for post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that's not something that you found, correct?
Number 2, no.
And so that brings us up to number 1, correct?
Yes.
And this section is called persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and the numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma, as indicated by 3 or more, correct?
Yes.
And the first one, what does that talk about?
It talks about efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma.
Okay. And you found this one, correct?
I did.
And what efforts did she, according to you, undertake to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma?
I took her original story as an effort or an occurrence that separated her from the realities of the trauma. And by creating this other story, it created a psychological distance between what happened that she was responsible for and what she first claimed happened when she was the victim of this, well, obviously false story about what had happened on that day.
So what you're talking about under number 1 is a lie. She told a lie, and based on the fact that she told a lie, that was her effort to avoid feelings, conversations associated with the killing.
I'm not characterizing it as a lie.
You're characterizing it as a story.
Yes, as a story, a defense mechanism.
You call it a defense mechanism, but this defense mechanism, as the way these things have come out, based on what you tell us about what was told later, is a story, isn't it?
Yes.
But there are other things that she did during this period of time that affect this. Are you familiar with the fact that she sent 20 irises to Mr. Alexander's grandmother?
I don't remember the number being 20, but I do remember that, yes.
And in fact, if she admitted to that, that's not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the killing, is it?
It's an effort to distance herself from the reality of the fact that she did the killing.
And that effort requires thinking, doesn't it?
Yes.
So in her thinking about the 20 irises, she's thinking about the killing, right?
She's thinking of the event and the actions of maintaining normalcy as a result of what had happened, in my opinion, it's very similar to what happens in a dissociative identity disorder, where a whole alternative reality exists. Now, I didn't use that diagnosis here, but as part of her defense mechanism, I believe that she created this alternative reality which insulated her from the pain of dealing with what had happened that she was responsible for, and carried on as if the alternative reality was the truth.
So bottom line is, she did think about it, right? And that's why she thought about the killing, and that's why she sent the irises, right?
I don't know whether she thought about it. There's no way that I can say.
Then why else would she send 20 irises unless she was thinking about Mr. Alexander being dead, whether it be by one story or the other?
Well, obviously sending the irises was in response to him being deceased. That's true.
Right. And she knew, according to you, there was 1 or 2 realities, right? She knew that either these 2 people came in and killed him, or she killed him, right?
Right.
So she's thinking about the trauma then, right?
Not thinking about the trauma in terms of her being the actor or the person who did the killing.
Right. She's thinking about the trauma in terms of somebody putting the gun to her head, though, right?
That's correct.
So she is then thinking about the trauma, right?
A trauma, right, a trauma.
Right, the trauma that she designated in the PDS, right, under number 4.
Correct.
The other thing that she did with regard to this is that, isn't it true that she went on national television with a show called 48 Hours, right?
That's true.
She did it on 2 occasions, right?
Yes.
And during those 2 occasions, she talked about her thoughts, her feelings, and had a conversation associated with the killing, right?
Yes.
So now we have 2 examples where she's thinking about the killing, right?
Well, we don't know what she was thinking.
You don't think that when she's asked about Travis Alexander by a correspondent that she's not thinking about the killing? What could she possibly be thinking about then?
The alternatives to the fact that she killed him.
I'm not, but she's thinking about the trauma. He's dead, right?
She's thinking about the trauma, that's right.
This here just says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. It says that, right?
That's right, it says that.
And that comes straight from DSM-4, right?
That's right.
And you said that that was the Bible, right?
Absolutely.
And so it doesn't say, with regard to the trauma, it doesn't say whether she killed him or not, does it?
It also doesn't say absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. It says efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. Efforts. These efforts may not always be successful.
And that's not my question. My question here doesn't distinguish the trauma, does it?
No.
Which is the point that you were trying to make to me with regard to the PDS, right?
Correct.
The trauma doesn't matter, right?
In that case, yes.
Yeah, so why does it not matter with the PDS and it does matter here? Aren't you being a bit selective?
I'm not sure I understand the point you're trying to make.
Sure you do understand the question. The PDS, you told us it doesn't matter what the trauma is, right?
At the time that I scored it, correct. Yes.
Well, no, even now you're telling us when you testified that the trauma doesn't matter.
The trauma did not matter. It was her
Right.
it was her internal perceptions of the emotional reactions to whatever trauma occurred, which is what I measured.
And the trauma doesn't matter is what you said. And so you said you could still use that test and don't have to rescore it because the trauma doesn't matter. That's what you said
That's
in
right.
response to a jury's question, right?
Yes.
So if that analysis applies for the PDS, you're saying, that analysis does not apply to the DSM-4, even though the PDS was used to corroborate the post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
I'm afraid I'm not getting the point.
Sustained.
Sir, you did use the PDS to support or corroborate your finding that this was post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
And you said, with regard to that, the trauma doesn't matter, right?
Yes.
With regard to this, by its own definition, it says effects to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, right?
Yes.
It doesn't say first or second story, does it?
No, it doesn't. It talks about the trauma of being either, at one point, an observer to the killing or being the actor in the killing.
Right. So when you start trying to make this distinction with me about she doesn't know whether or not she killed him, it's just trauma that we're talking about, whether or not it was her that killed him or somebody else, right?
That's the point I'm making, yes.
So we get back to the 48 hours interview when you're saying, we discussed this and the question was, well, isn't it true that she discussed thoughts, feelings, conversations associated with the trauma in the 48 hours interview?
Yes.
So again, that speaks against what's in number 1, doesn't it?
I'm sorry, I don't see it that way.
Right, you wouldn't see that way because you have feelings for the defendant, right?
I beg your pardon, sir.
Jose, the objection.
It's argumentative, totally
Thank
inappropriate.
We approach, Your Honor.
You may.
You don't see it that way, right? It's your opinion, right?
Yes, it is.
And
As well
this-
as my professional opinion.
It's your professional opinion based on these 35 years that you've been telling us about, right?
That's correct.
Sir, one of the other things that we know in this case is that the defendant spoke with Leslie Jodi. You're familiar with that, right?
Could you refresh my memory?
Sure.
Mr. Udi?
Objection, Judge Bianco.
Approach, please.
Sir, we had information that the defendant, after traveling to Utah, spoke to Leslie Jodi about Mr. Alexander. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And in fact, one of the questions I think that you might have addressed involved the fact that she told Miss Jodi about the fact that her children were going to play with Mr. Alexander's children. You remember that?
I do.
That's not avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
Well, it is.
How could it possibly be? Because isn't the person that was killed Travis Alexander?
It was.
Isn't it true that Travis Alexander was the subject of that conversation that we just discussed?
Yes, but she could not have had that conversation if she was admitting to the fact that she killed him. And so her conversation was her way of avoiding thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. At that point, the trauma in her mind, her perception, was that she did it, no matter what she told me.
But isn't it true in that conversation that she's the one that brought up Mr. Alexander? Are you aware of that?
Well, I can only aware of what I read. I don't know for sure.
Overruled.
Are you aware of that? Yes or no?
I don't know if she was the one who brought it up, but there was a conversation to that effect.
Let's assume that it was her that brought it up. Wouldn't that be contrary to what we have listed in number 1?
No, sir, not. It would not be.
The other thing that we know is that she sent a letter to the family. Are you aware of that?
To the whom?
The family of
Yes.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes, I am.
Again, she sent this letter to the family talking about the killing, right? You've read that, right?
Yes.
It's an 18-page letter, right?
Yes.
And it's a very long, detailed letter, isn't it?
Yes.
That doesn't show, she had to go to the effort of addressing it, didn't she?
Yes.
She had to go to the effort of getting it mailed, right?
Yes.
And she had to go through the effort of finding the address, right?
I don't know whether she had the address or not, but yes. She had to find
If she did have the address, she would have to have addressed it, correct?
Correct.
So that is not an effort to avoid thoughts, feelings, or associations, conversations associated with the trauma, is it?
It is, if the trauma was killing Mr. Alexander.
Well, no, the
Because-
trauma here, again, we keep going back to this. Isn't the trauma that Mr. Alexander is dead? By whatever means?
Well, that's one aspect of the trauma, but the reality is her experience was that she did do the killing, and her perceptions and her emotions are tied into what actually occurred, not the story that was made up as a way of separating herself from the horror of what had happened on that day.
Going back to the PDS, you told us that the trauma didn't matter for purposes of your assessment, right?
That's correct,
But
because
you're
what the
ma-
PDS measures were her emotional states and her perceptions of the trauma, whatever happened. And at the time that it was administered, she was telling this alternative story, but the reality was she was responding to the emotional components, which is what the PDS measures, as a person who did commit this crime.
And killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Involved what?
Killing Mr. Alexander involved trauma, right?
Yes.
Whether it be by her hand or somebody else's hand, it involved trauma,
That's
right?
right.
So this is what this is talking about, whether her hand or somebody else's hand, isn't it? It doesn't distinguish, it doesn't say, but the trauma has to be associated with the killer killing the person, does it?
Objection, asked and answered.
As I indicated earlier, the trauma involved the killing of Mr. Alexander. She experienced that regardless of the story that she was telling at the time. And so her psychological reactivity and her psychological defense mechanisms were helping her avoid the thoughts, feelings, and conversations associated with her having been the perpetrator of that killing.
My question is, trauma doesn't distinguish between the killer or somebody who was a witness, does it?
Well, that aspect of the trauma, correct. That's correct.
It does not. The other thing that we know is that you've read her journals, right?
I did.
And you've read the journals post-killing of Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
And in it, she goes out of her way to talk about Mr. Alexander, doesn't she?
Well, it's for the exact same reason.
But the bottom line is she does go out of her way, which of course expresses her thoughts and feelings in that journal, right?
Correct. But
about the trauma, right?
Yes.
The other thing that we know is that Mr. Alexander had a memorial service. I believe she said either July 15th or July 16th are her words. You're aware of that,
I
right?
am.
And she attended the memorial service. You're aware of that, right?
I believe so.
And if she attended that memorial service, certainly that is not an effort to avoid thinking, feeling, or talking about the trauma, is it?
It was her way of avoiding dealing with the fact that she was responsible for that trauma by allowing herself to go through life at that time in a manner consistent with having been a victim of the trauma. Not dealing with the fact that she did perpetrate the trauma.
Now you're adding an extra element here, responsibility, aren't you? You're adding responsibility to the word trauma, aren't you? You're saying, well, she's trying to deal with her responsibility in this issue. And that's how she chose to deal with it.
Well, perhaps I misspoke there.
And this is irrespective of responsibility, isn't it?
An individual's inner perceptions is not independent of the nature of the trauma.
And all of this is based on what she told you, right?
That's correct.
And so you know that she goes to the memorial service, so she has to think about going to the memorial service, right?
Well, yes.
And so she has to book a flight, right?
Yes.
Did you know that it was a flight that
No,
she
I
took?
didn't know it was a flight when she got there.
Do you want to see the
somehow.
receipt?
Pardon me?
Do you want to see the receipt that shows she took a flight?
I don't need to see the receipt.
All right. The other thing is, it requires that she make her way from the airport over to Mesa, which is where she told us the memorial service was. It requires some thought there, right?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not she went over to the house during the time that she was here at the memorial service?
I don't know that.
And if she had gone over there, wouldn't that indicate something to you that she is doing anything but avoiding thoughts about the killing?
I don't know that she went to the house.
But assuming she did, if you assume that she went over to the house with somebody named Aaron, assume that, wouldn't that indicate that she was not attempting to avoid thinking about the trauma?
If her actions were part of an avoidance reaction, a defense mechanism, a dissociative reality, then it would be consistent with going to that site because she wouldn't have been responding as if she was the perpetrator. And so, again, I don't know that she did go over there, but if you have something that I can read to confirm that, I would be appreciative.
That would make a difference for you?
Well, I'd like to
If,
see
for
that. Yeah, I
example,
don't
somebody
remember.
named Aaron Mortensen went over there with her?
I beg your pardon?
If somebody actually went over there to the crime scene with her afterwards? That would
Well, I'm at this point, I don't recall what the details were. I'm assuming that you're a man of your word, and what you're telling me is actual, so I'll go along with that.
But here again, we're talking about trauma. It doesn't distinguish between responsibility. It doesn't talk about responsibility. It just talks about trauma, doesn't it?
Well, there are different kinds of trauma, and there are
Right.
different
And-
levels of trauma.
And you've told us that it doesn't make any difference in the trauma experienced by a police officer, right? It doesn't make any difference, does it? If it's a police officer or her, right? In terms of PTSD.
Well, it's a person's reactions to a trauma that determines whether or not they develop PTSD.
Didn't you just tell us when you were asked by the jurors, there was a question involving, are you saying that the defendant's PTSD is the same as that of a police officer? And you said that it was?
No, what I said was that it met the same criteria. It's not caused by the same factors,
Right.
but it has the same characteristics. Indeed, all cases of PTSD all fall under the same diagnostic criteria.
Right, because the trauma doesn't look at the responsibility of it, does it? In other words, it doesn't look as to whether you are rightful in doing it as opposed to wrongful in doing it, right?
It has an impact on one's perceptions of the intensity of the trauma.
Right. But whether or not a person has this intensity of this PTSD, it is PTSD, whether it's slight PTSD or strong PTSD, right?
Correct.
So when you say that the police officer's PTSD may not be as strong as hers, it's still PTSD, right?
It still falls under the diagnostic criteria, yes.
Right. So that the trauma, in other words, whether you are killing wrongfully or rightfully, in your mind, it's still trauma that triggers PTSD, right?
Both would be trauma, but of a different nature.
Sure, but it's trauma, right?
Yes.
And the same analysis applies to somebody in war in Afghanistan. You told us that, right?
Yes.
As it does to the defendant, right?
Yeah, in terms of the diagnosis of PTSD.
Sure. And C1 illustrates that point, doesn't it?
Correct.
So, with regard to that, one of the things that we know is that she talked in the journals about Mr. Alexander, right?
Yes.
She talked over and over about him, didn't she?
Yes.
That's-
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
That's not an avoidance of feelings or thoughts about him, is it?
Yes, it can be, because if she's talking about him in flowing terms and how wonderful he was, it's a way of insulating her from the harsh reality that she did the killing. And so that method of dealing with his demise is very different than someone saying, oh my gosh, I've done this horrible thing, and I take all full responsibility for that. It's a different way of dealing with a similar situation. But it's very different in terms of the internal perceptions and in terms of the emotional reactivity of the client.
It requires thinking to write down what she did in her journals, right?
Yes?
And it requires thinking about the trauma, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Irrespective of whether it's rightful or wrongful, it requires that. So there was nothing that required her, for example, she wasn't attending a course in school that required her to write in those journals, right?
Correct.
It was a voluntary effort on her part, correct?
She has used journal writing as a way of dealing with her life since she was in school.
That's
This
not
is an
my
extension of that. This is not a new activity.
It's not my question. Nobody forced her to write in those journals,
No,
did
one
they?
forced her to write.
And it required her to think about it before she wrote whatever she wrote in those journals, right?
Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Well, and it wasn't that she just had one entry in there. She had many entries, right?
Yes.
And she continued on up till at least a day or two until her arrest, right?
Correct.
The other thing, sir, is that shortly after this killing, the defendant called Mr. Alexander's answering machine. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
That's not an effort to avoid thinking about the trauma, is it?
It's consistent, however, with her psychological condition of having created an alternative reality which allowed her to function in life because it was a way that she was able to deny having been the perpetrator of the crime.
In terms of that telephone call, it required her to pick up the telephone to make the call, didn't it?
Yes.
It required, whether or not she had him on speed dial or otherwise, it required her to manually do something by pushing at least one button, correct?
Sure.
And it required her, while she was on the phone, to speak, right? So even though the trauma had already occurred, it required her to express her thoughts, feelings in a one-sided conversation on the telephone, right?
She did do that.
Additionally, didn't she also send an email?
Yes.
And this email was sent to Mr. Alexander's account, wherever the account was, right?
Yes.
And so that required her to think about sitting down and composing an email to him, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And she sat wherever it was that she sat, and she